Chapter 21 Professor Frawdysham. The morning after the funerals, Spittleworth knocked on the door of the king's apartments again and entered, carrying a lot of scrolls, which he let fall onto the table where the king sat. "Spittleworth," said Fred, who was still wearing his medal for outstanding bravery against the deadly Ickabog, and had dressed in a scarlet suit, the better to show it off. "These cakes aren't as good as usual." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, your majesty," said Spittleworth. "I thought it right for the widow Beamish to take a few days off work. These are the work of the under-pastry chef." "Well, they're chewy," said Fred, dropping half his folderol fancy back onto his plate. "And what are all these scrolls?" "These, sire, are suggestions for improving the kingdom's defences against the Ickabog." "Excellent," said King Fred, moving the cakes and teapot aside to make more room as Spittleworth pulled up a chair. "The very first thing to be done, your majesty, was to find out as much as we could about the Ickabog itself, the better to discover how to defeat it." "Well, yes, but how, Spittleworth? The monster is a mystery. Everyone thought it was a fantasy for all these years." "Forgive me, but that is where your majesty is wrong," said Spittleworth. "By dint of ceaseless searching, I've managed to find the foremost Ickabog expert in all of Cornucopia. Lord Flapoon is waiting with him in the hall." Bring him in, said Fred. So Spittleworth left the room and returned shortly afterwards with Lord Flapoon and a little old man with snowy white hair and spectacles so thick that his eyes had vanished almost into nothingness. "This, sire, is Professor Frawdysham," said Flapoon, as the mole-like little man made a deep bow to the king. "What he doesn't know about Ickabogs isn't worth knowing." "How is it that I've never heard of you before, Professor Frawdysham?" asked the king, who was thinking that if he had known the Ickabog was real enough to have its own expert, he would never have gone looking for it in the first place. "I live a retired life, your majesty," said Professor Frawdysham with the second bow. "So few people believe in the Ickabog that I've formed the habit of keeping my knowledge to myself." King Fred was satisfied with this answer, which was a relief to Spittleworth, because Professor Frawdysham was no more real than Private Buttons, or indeed old Widow Buttons, in her ginger wig, who had howled at the funeral. The truth was that beneath the wigs and the glasses, Professor Frawdysham and Widow Buttons were the same person, Lord Spittleworth's butler, who was called Otto Scrumble, and he looked after Lord Spittleworth's estate while he lived at the palace. Like his master, Scrumble would do anything for gold, and had agreed to impersonate both the widow and the professor for 100 ducats. "So, what can you tell about the Ickabog, Professor Frawdysham?" asked the king. "Well, let's see," said the pretend professor, who'd been told by Spittleworth what he ought to say. "It's as tall as 2 horses. "If not taller," interrupted Fred, whose nightmares had featured a gigantic Ickabog ever since he'd returned from the marshlands. "If, as your majesty says, not taller," agreed Frawdysham. "I should estimate that a medium-sized Ickabog would be as tall as 2 horses, whereas a large specimen might reach the size of, let's see, 2 elephants, suggested the king. 2 elephants, agreed Frawdysham, with eyes like lamps, of glowing balls of fire, suggested the king again. "The very image I was about to employ, sire," said Frawdysham. "And can the monster really speak the human tongue?" asked Fred, in whose nightmares the monster whispered, "The king, I want the king," as it crept through the dark streets towards the palace. "Yes, indeed," said Frawdysham with another low bow. "We believe the Ickabog learnt to speak human by taking people prisoner." "Oh," whispered Fred. "Moreover," said Frawdysham, "the Ickabog has a long and vengeful memory. If outwitted by a victim, as you outwitted it, sire, by escaping its deadly clutches, it has sometimes sneaked out of the marsh under cover of darkness and claimed its victim while he or she slept." "What is to be done? I'm doomed," Fred croaked. "Nonsense, your majesty," said Spittleworth. "I have devised a whole raft of measures for your protection." So saying, Spittleworth took hold of one of the scrolls he'd brought with him and unrolled it. There, covering most of the table, was a coloured picture of a monster that resembled a dragon. It was huge and ugly, with thick black scales, gleaming white eyes, a tail that ended in a poisonous spike, a fanged mouth large enough to swallow a man, and long razor-sharp claws. There are several problems to be overcome when defending against an Ickabog, said Professor Frawdysham, now taking out a short stick and pointing in turn to the fangs, the claws, and the poisonous tail. But the most difficult challenge is that killing an Ickabog causes 2 new Ickabogs to emerge from the corpse of the first. Surely not, said Fred. Oh yes, Your Majesty, said Frawdysham. I have made a lifelong study of the monster, and I can assure you my findings are quite correct. Your Majesty might remember that many of the old tales of the Ickabog make mention of this curious fact, interjected Spittleworth, who really needed the king to believe this particular trait of the Ickabog, because his plan relied on it. But it seems so unlikely, said Fred. It does, on the surface, doesn't it, sire? Said Spittleworth. But in truth it's one of those extraordinary, unbelievable ideas that only the very cleverest people can grasp, whereas common, stupid folk, sire, giggle and laugh at the notion. Fred looked from Spittleworth to Flapoon to Professor Frawdysham. All 3 men seemed to be waiting for him to prove how clever he was, and naturally he didn't want to seem stupid, so he said, Well, if the Professor says it, then that's good enough for me. But if the monster turns into 2 monsters every time it dies, how do we kill it? Well, in the first phase of our plan, we don't, said Spittleworth. We don't? Spittleworth now unrolled a second scroll, which showed a map of Cornucopia. The northernmost tip had a drawing of a gigantic Ickabog on it, and all around the edge of the wide marsh stood 100 little stick figures holding swords. Fred looked closely to see whether any of them were wearing a crown, and was relieved to see none were. As you can see, Your Majesty, our first proposal is a special Ickabog Defence Brigade. These men will patrol the edge of the marshland to ensure the Ickabog cannot leave. We estimate the cost of such a brigade, including uniforms, weapons, horses, wages, training, board, lodging, sick pay, danger money, birthday presents, and medals, to be around 10,000 ducats. 10,000 ducats, repeated King Fred. That's a lot of gold. However, when it comes to protecting me, I mean Cornucopia, 10,000 ducats is a small price to pay, finished Spittleworth. 10,000 a month, Spittleworth added. 10,000 a month? Yes, sire, said Spittleworth. If we're to truly defend the kingdom, the expense will be considerable. However, if Your Majesty feels that we could manage with fewer weapons— No, I didn't say that. Naturally, we don't expect Your Majesty to bear the expense alone, continued Spittleworth. You don't? Said Fred, suddenly hopeful. Oh no, sire, that would be grossly unfair. After all, the entire country will benefit from the Ickabog Defence Brigade. I suggest we impose an Ickabog tax. We'll ask every household in Cornucopia to pay 1 gold ducat a month. Of course, this means the recruitment and training of many new tax collectors, but if we raise the amount to 2 ducats, we can cover the cost of them too. Admirable, Spittleworth, said King Fred. What a brain you have. Why, 2 ducats a month. People will barely notice the loss.